So outputs versus outcomes is a really important kind of discussion because it sets the stage for the difference between what we've always done when people ask us to give evaluation and what it's important to do when we talk about the outcomes of the program. So that's what I'm going to try and march through. So the first thing to think about is, how do programs create change? So this is a really simple model that kind of sets up these three boxes. And so you can see in the top middle, all of us are trying to address some sort of a social problem or issue or condition. We want to improve reading, or we want to increase test scores, or we want to decrease numbers of people who are unvaccinated. I mean, there's just, no matter what the issue is, we as human service agencies and social service agencies are creating programs to address problems. So this problem exists, your program has been created, and you want to get money for it. So if you zip down to the left box, then you create this program. You do a job training program, or you do parent education, or you create a teen center. You have these things that you want to do and you need money to do them. And so you then convince a funder like United Way that you're a really good value and that you can do these things really well. And to prove that, you scoot over to the right box and you start to think through, how am I actually going to measure whether change takes place? And you can do lots of different ways to measure change. You can measure things like knowledge and attitudes and beliefs and behavior and in the environment. You can even measure changes in policy and things like that. But at the end of the day, in its most simple form, what you're trying to do is show that something either increased or something decreased. You're trying to create a change, and you need to measure whether or not something has gone up. More people have been trained and are now able to implement a certain kind of protocol, or that people have gotten this job training and they're now able to get jobs, or there's people that are now increasing in their knowledge or their skills or their abilities or their behaviors, or they're decreasing something that they didn't want to do. And that's what your program is trying to do. And our job is to try to figure out how to measure it. So, simplest term, evaluation is a process, meaning it doesn't happen just once, it happens over time. You're systematically trying to gather data and other sorts of information. You're trying to identify the strengths and weaknesses of a project or a program, and then that leads to some sort of a report. So in case you need to be convinced of this, and most of the people that go to my classes need to be convinced of this because we require them to take this class. It's not an elective. Why evaluate? So a couple of reasons. One is that you need to determine the extent to which your initial goals are being reached. If you said you were going to do this, then you've got to show people that you did in fact do that. And there's some really good reasons why you want that to be done. Part of that is that just because the idea is good and your heart's in the right place doesn't mean that change actually takes place. And I could give you example after example after example. One really simple one that I oftentimes use is the DARE program. Most of us know about the DARE program when they had police officers coming into schoolrooms and telling kids, don't do drugs. Drugs are bad. And they'd show pictures of what drugs look like, and they'd talk to them about the consequences. And maybe they'd have 2 or 3 sessions total, and then they'd say, kids, how many of you aren't going to do drugs? I'm really simplifying, obviously. And everybody'd raise their hand that they weren't going to do drugs, and then they'd often have to sign a pledge saying that they weren't going to do drugs. And these programs were wildly popular through the United States and still exist in a different form than they originally did. But the original format was one that everyone was very excited about, and millions of dollars were spent and millions of hours of time were spent in classrooms doing this. And evaluation after evaluation showed that when they tracked kids over time, there was no difference between the kids that had signed these pledge forms and that had gone through the training and those who didn't. And there's some reasons for that. some of it was that just telling people about something doesn't actually change their behavior. You have to actually help them to practice skills. And there's a whole series of things that help people to change. And you also have to have dose response, meaning basically you have to keep inoculating. I'm using the metaphor of the day, but you have to keep kind of updating the knowledge, and you have to keep helping kids to learn that stuff over time. And so they've now made some improvements, and the DARE program is now called DARE Plus, I think, and it's way better than it used to be, and it's showing some small improvements in students over time. But good example of great intentions, great heart, great excitement, lots of money spent, and no outcomes at all. So you sure have to determine which goals are being reached, and you also need to gather information so that you can make decisions. So sometimes that's to continue a program. Is it sustainable over time? Is it something that is actually showing that it is making a difference in people's lives? Or in some cases, there may be a time when you have to terminate a program, and that's sometimes when the program is failing, and sometimes that's just when the program has kind of outlived its usefulness and is no longer needed anymore. And as most of us know, we're much better at starting programs than we are at ending them, because we kind of like to perpetuate ourselves and our jobs and everything else. So it's one of those tricky balances where we need to understand, is it working? Is it continuing to work? And do we want to actually make the changes necessary in order for it to continue to work? And one of the things I'll have to say, I've been working with United Way, and some of you have been for a very long time and are now getting refunded. But one of the things that I've so appreciated about United Way is that if something isn't working, as long as you're able to show that change isn't happening, but you're saying, look, we see that this isn't working the way we thought it was, but we have this idea for why, and we think that if we changed it in such and such a way, we can get better results. United Way is really good at working with people to try and make those adjustments. They don't just come along and say, oh, your evaluation showed your program doesn't work, we're no longer going to fund you. I have seen only a couple of times when funding was removed, and that was after an excruciatingly long process where the United Way staff worked really, really hard to try to help them get on board, and it just didn't work. But it was really rare. The more regular part of why evaluation happens and why the United Way likes to see evaluation is not only can they report this to funders that they get money from, but also because it helps programs to get better. So that's really, really why it's important. And I think hopefully that can take away some of that fear about doing evaluation, because a lot of times we worry that if we show that something isn't working, then automatically the rug will get jerked out from under us. And that really hasn't been the case with United Way. I've been really impressed with the way that they've managed that process. So just a couple of barriers to evaluation. Well, first of all, sometimes people have kind of this philosophical bias. I know that's a little bit high-minded language, but basically the idea is that if you're doing some interventions, the argument is, well, we can't measure the changes that we're making. We can't measure the kind of interactions, the relationships that are formed and how change happens. That can't just be quantified in numbers and reports and things like that. And there's an argument to that, but the amazing thing is that there's lots of stuff that can be measured, and usually you can figure out something that's measurable. The other argument, I think, and this is a pretty good one in some ways, is that scientific evaluations aren't relevant to real life. And that's probably true if they're done in really, really high-end, complicated ways. And so an example of that might be, you really want your COVID vaccine to be tested very, very carefully, using very careful protocols across thousands and thousands of people, across ages, across gender, across all of these things. You really want it to go through the paces, but that's time consuming and it costs a whole lot of money. So we aren't going to be able to do that kind of a really high-end analysis. And so we've got to settle for what real life is, and that is evaluation in the real world. And so we can see that things can move forward in really positive ways. And we can usually track those things, but we may not be able to say that with all certainty that the evaluation that we've done shows that this program works in all settings with all populations across all time. But we shouldn't not do it just because it isn't done perfectly. So that's kind of the argument on that side. A lot of people don't do it because it's just time consuming for some people. And one of the reasons why I'm trying to do this evaluation training for you is to kind of say, it's not as time consuming as it used to be. It's way easier and way faster and way less complicated because the tools are better and the communication processes are easier and the reports are so much easier to produce now than they used to be. And so I think that that helps with some of the barriers, even though it still does take time. And I know that it's frustrating because it takes time away from doing the things that you really care about and that feel and do make a difference. But the reason why you want to do it is because you then can show that you're making that change. And that has implications for not only your funding, but also it's even been shown with really good evidence that if you show your clients that they're making progress, that boosts their progress and their ability to then be more successful than they would otherwise. So even tracking individual clients and their progress through evaluation makes a difference, not just program level. Some people fear that the results may be used against staff. I already really talked about that, at least in as it relates to United Way. I think there's also the fear within some agencies that administrators will use that as an excuse, like if they didn't like you or they were wanting to get rid of you in the first place, all they need to do is to find some excuse and they can get rid of you. Most agencies I've seen aren't that mercenary and don't operate on that level. And most of the time, if you're working as a team, you're doing these reports in order to give information to outside entities like the United Way. But I would argue you really want to use this information in order to make your internal program better. And so we'll talk in just a few minutes after the break about the difference between what we call process versus outcome evaluation and how you can do that a little bit differently. Some people also fear that clients can be exploited, and that's around confidentiality issues. There's ways that you can build in to make sure that clients are not exposing who they actually are through some anonymity and things like that. So I don't think that that needs to be a realistic issue either. Okay. So as you already know, your funders care. There's only limited funding, and so programs that show success are more likely to be funded. Your agency director, you may be the agency director, so hopefully you care because there's time and money efficiency. You want to do the thing that's the best that can be done with your resources and with your time. Your clients want efficient and effective change, and they would much prefer being in a program that is making a difference in their lives to one that isn't. So you could think that they would appreciate that change takes place. And then you hopefully want to know that you're doing things that work, and you can also, keep your job, get promoted, gain future funding, all of those things. And those are all good things. And I think most people like that. So those are some of the reasons why people care. Okay, so let's talk about logic models. A logic model, and for those of you that were here 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, when COVID first struck, some of this may be a little redundant, but I think you'll find that even with some of the repetition, that it gets a little more clear each time you see it. So I'll try not to linger too long in each of the categories and break it down so that it's really clear, because what I found is that if you do a logic model, your brain is so much clearer about what your agency does and how it's done, particularly if you have multiple programs and you do logic models for each one. And it's also a super easy way if you're doing kind of that elevator speech where people need to know what your program is and does, that you can kind of talk them through with a really quick mental logic model, what it is that you do and what are the outcomes that you're expecting. So basically, a logic model is this systematic and visual way to present and share your understanding of the relationship between the resources you have, usually that's money and buildings and those kinds of things, the activities that you're doing, and the change that you hope that the activities produce. So sometimes when you see grant proposals, I know I've read hundreds and hundreds of grant proposals, and people oftentimes get really tied up into knots explaining the minutia and details of something. And if they would use a logic model to kind of organize even how they write up their grant, they're going to be much more able to explain each of the pieces of their program and then justify why they want to fund those particular outcomes and how then they're going to measure them. So I think that it's a really powerful tool that you can use in order to create that change. Okay, so here's the very, very simplest form of a logic model. Now I'm going to keep adding layers as we go, but this is basically it. You have these inputs, things that you put into your program, money, time, resources, and ultimately the activities that you do. You have outputs, things that you can count, things that you're doing that can be like numbers of this or amount of that or number of people served, that kind of thing. Those are outputs, and we'll tell you this in a more formal way in just a second. And then there are outcomes. This is, did change happen? So again, think about outcomes is, did something go up? Did it improve? Or did something go down? Did it get better? Or maybe you wanted something to go down. You wanted a negative behavior, a negative outcome to go down. So you wanted unemployment to go down, or you wanted maybe, I don't know, crime to go down, but maybe you want reading scores to go up. So depending on which direction you're going, your outcomes will help you to kind of think through how you're going to measure those things. So you have those three things: outputs that then lead to outcomes, but inputs that lead to outputs. Okay, so you can still see here that this is where we're going to add some more detail. So you can still see those, the orange box, the green box, and the sort of salmon colored box, at least on my screen, is inputs, outputs, and outcomes. So if we were going to break that down even further, inputs are our program investments, what we invest, time, money, buildings, resources, all of that. Outputs are the activities that we do. So, the reading program that we do, or the crime prevention program that we do, or the education about healthy eating, or whatever it happens to be, any of those activities that your agency does, that's what you do. And then your participation is who you reach. So numbers of people, maybe you're going to do 200 people that get this service, or you're going to do 50 people that receive these blankets, or there are going to be 10,000 people that are in that get the vaccine, something like that. But participation shows who you reach, and those are outputs because you're counting those things. When you come to outcomes, that is what results came out as a result of the program. And so usually when we think about outcomes, we think about the results short-term, medium, and long-term. And for the most part, we don't even care about long-term with most agencies, because long-term usually has to do with these ultimate impacts that you're trying to change, big picture community things over time. So maybe, reductions in crime or reductions in unemployment. And those are really hard to measure, and they're really hard to track over time, just because of the complexity of people and the ways that they, can be difficult to track down and find, and so many variables that are impacting it. So usually when we're talking about outcomes, we're talking about short-term and possibly medium-term. Okay, hold on, I got stuck in the chat here. There we go. All right, so this is the exact same thing one more time, but this is adding a little bit more, because the reason it's called a logic model is that kind of the whole notion of logic is if then, if you do this, then that will happen. So if you start out with resources, there are certain resources that are needed to operate your program. The United Way is wanting to give you those resources, we hope. And so you start out with money and time and staffing and buildings and all of these other things. And those are your resources that you're putting into the program. If you have access to the resources, United Way gives you funding, then you can use them to accomplish your planned activities. So that's when you can implement your program, whatever your reading program or your crime reduction program or your police retraining program, whatever it happens to be, those are activities that you do, and that's what you're really proposing for your United Way funding. So that's your planned work, that bottom square or rectangle on the bottom. So you did your activities. Then if you accomplish your activities, then you will hopefully deliver the amount of the product or the service that you intended. Now realize that's the amount of something that you did, number of days of services that you provided, or number of blankets that you distributed, or meals, or the number of people that attended your training. All of those things are things that you can count. And outputs have generally been the sort of thing that we report to our boards. We say, in the last year, we served 3,286 clients, and 800 training sessions were made, and 500 people received such and such and so and so. But outputs are great because they kind of tell you that you did things, but you don't actually know if people's lives were changed. What if you were doing the DARE program and you served thousands of kids, but the outcomes didn't actually change? So after you do your outputs, then if you accomplish your planned activities to the extent that you intended, then your participants should benefit in certain ways. Those are your outcomes. And then ultimately, if those benefits of participation have happened, then certain changes are going to happen in the community and the organization, and you maybe expect that the community will be better as a result. But we generally don't go as far as impact when we think about logic models, just because those are the big, expensive, complex programs that are usually run by governments, at least at the county level, sometimes at the state level, and at the federal level. That's kind of where we see more impact, because there's more money, and obviously sometimes lots of money is put in and impacts don't change. So that's a whole other discussion. Okay, so how will activities lead to desired outcomes? So again, this is the logic of it: if then, if then, if then. So if we were using a tutoring program as an example, if we invest time and money, then we can provide tutoring 3 hours a week at one school per year for 50 children. If we do that, then students struggling academically can be tutored. If the kids are tutored, then we hope they will learn and improve their skills. If that happens, that's the short-term outcome. They'll learn and improve skills. The medium-term outcome would be then they will get better grades. And then ultimately, I would say, if we were going to go all the way to impact, it would be that we'd start moving the needle on the county's numbers of kids that graduate or that get ready for third grade and have access to, good reading skills, that sort of thing. So we need to think sort of in terms of levels, and that's why we usually only think short term and medium term. So, common problem is that activities and strategies often don't lead to the desired outcomes. We have these things that we do, but we either can't measure them very well, or we have problems kind of linking that activity to what we want to have outcome. And so you need to kind of go through your if-then statements and see if they kind of logically connect to each other, and the logic model is what makes those connections explicit. And so, your common joke here is, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2, and that's oftentimes the way that evaluations kind of get put together, is that there's this big leap in logic where it's really hard to understand the relationship between the output that someone did and the outcome that came out as a result. Okay, now you remember a couple of slides back, we had 2 squares at the bottom. I'm going to scoot back really fast. Yeah, see this bottom rectangle here, your planned work and your intended results. Okay, this is where I'm going to go into a little deeper dive. So your planned work is the first one. Okay, so we scoot forward here. So your planned work is the resources and what you intend to do. So think of your resources, and I've said this already, is the money that you're getting from the United Way and other funders, or your fundraisers, or whatever that happens to be, the time that you put in, the staff that you hire, the expertise and the training that people have to get, the methods that they have to learn or to implement, and the facilities. That's all resources that help make it possible for you to do what you want to do. The program activities, which is that second box over, is what the program does with the resources. So that's, you know, the processes that you put into place, the tools, the events, the technologies, the trainings, the, you know, whatever your intervention is, those are the program activities, the things you do in order to make the change happen that you want to have happen. And then in that far right quadrant that we were at just a minute ago, your intended results, that's that rectangle box that was in that slide earlier. This is your intended results, and that includes all of the outputs and the outcomes and ultimately the impact. So the outputs, remember, are what we can count. The products created or delivered, the number of people that you serve, the activities or services that you carried out, all good things, and we need to know them. And there may even be some programs where the output is what you desire, right? So let's say that you're doing meals. The output is number of meals that you distributed, and that's great. That's telling us that, you know, people got nutrition. Now, we could, I suppose, come along and somehow measure whether or not people's nutritional abilities were somehow, you know, something was balanced or not balanced, and whether or not they stayed healthy as a result. That's a lot harder to measure, and we'd never do that. So usually when we think about things where the output is the final product, that's usually for basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, the things that are kind of on the bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you remember Maslow from your psychology, intro to psychology days. But it's those basic things. And, you know, the United Way does fund basic needs, right? I mean, we had the floods that happened a couple of years ago down in Niles and a few other places in Berrien Springs as well. And there was funding that was provided, and it really was about, you know, number of people that you were able to get cleaning supplies to, or to, you know, have access to a place to stay, or, I mean, just all that basic stuff. Those are outputs, but those are kind of the end product for basic needs. For most other things that we do, and this is probably, I don't know, 70, 80% of all of the rest of your programs, it's not outputs, it's actually outcomes that you care the most about, because those show at some level that change is actually happening. So that's what we wish to achieve. That's what we want to accomplish. And the changes could be, as we said before, to their behavior, to their knowledge, to their skills, to their status, their level of functioning. Even satisfaction is a really good way. It's not the best, but it's a decent way to measure an outcome if people were satisfied with something that they got. Usually when we think about short-term outcomes, we think immediately, what did they get from the time your program started to the time it ended, or to the time that they finished whatever it was that they were doing as part of your program. To anywhere between there and 3 years might be considered short-term. Longer term is 4 to 6. These are kind of loose numbers, so there's no kind of magic to these numbers, but impact is really, it's that long slog of trying to really make change. An example of this in Berrien County is the Be Healthy Berrien initiative. That's this coalition between United Way and Spectrum Health, and I'm trying to remember some of the other partners. Think.
The health department and the YMCA.
Thank you. I knew Amanda would come through if I stumbled long enough. Thank you.
There's others, I know.
There are others too, but that's usually what we think about when we think about impact, because it's large numbers of organizations, or at least key organizations, that can come together to do a really big lift to change, you know, obesity rates in Berrien County, or to increase the amount of activity that kids get in their daily lives. Those kinds of things. Those are kind of big lifts, and they take more resources and more programs coming together. So that's why we don't tend not to talk about impact very much when we use our own logic models. Okay, I talked about that. I don't think I need to say anything more here. This is just breaking activities down even further: products and services and infrastructure, all of those things, but I've already mentioned that. So I thought maybe it might be helpful just to think really quickly, and this is where chat can come in, because 60 people or however many we're at right now is way too many to actually interact in that sort of way. But activities could be things like vaccine distribution or trauma training. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to put into chat just a few things that maybe you do that are your programs or your activities, just to give us a sense of where we're at. And it's sort of fun to see those things start to scroll down. What are your programs that you're trying to get funding for? And I can see chat, so I can probably read them off as they're popping up on the screen if somebody will be bold enough to. Here we go. So activities could include caregiver education, right? Support groups, early literacy, safe sleep. Yep, these are all programs, after school and summer day camps. Oh my goodness. All right. So suddenly we got about 15 of them that came through all at once. LGBT brave schools, great financial literacy training, career readiness, racial diversity inclusion, victim advocacy, right? Applied behavioral analysis. Some of these are really easier to measure because they have really kind of clear outcomes. Some of them are more complex to measure, like summer camps. How do we measure what changes happen with kids? And so you have to kind of think about, well, what do we actually want to do with these kids besides get them out of their parents' hair and get some good, clean activity and exercise and have fun and social skills? And suddenly you think to yourself, well, yeah, those are the things we want to measure. How can we actually measure some of those things? And I think you'll find from United Way's perspective, they're not asking you to measure everything in every way. They're asking you to measure a few things in some ways. Is that a safe statement, Amanda?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Amanda. Great. Free CDA training for licensed childcare providers. Yep. Good. That's an easy one because that one is kind of even an outcome, right? Because you can measure the number of certificates that you gave out to people. That one's pretty straightforward. Safe homes for foster children. So we'd have to think about what does it mean to be safe and how do we measure whether or not they're in safe homes. That probably has some criteria that are built in by the state. Equity in early child education. That's a fun one. Boy, but that's complex. So that would require some thinking about what kinds of outcomes do you actually want to see. Home-based skilled nursing support for those with cancer, right? Hi, Nancy. Lilia Brewer says youth training and youth food insecurity. So the question would be, what are you training them to do? And how are you increasing, or I should say decreasing, the food insecurity? So those are the kinds of things that you want to think about, is if I'm going to measure this, I have this program, what is it that's actually going to change? What is different by the time this person is done with my training program or my activity or whatever it is that I'm happening to do? So those are the real questions about activities that we think through. Thank you. Those are really helpful and some really good things that I'm sure that the United Way would be interested in funding. We'll just let Amanda nod silently. Okay. Get out of my chat here. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit more about outputs. I think I've said as much as I probably need to, but just to reinforce one last time, again, outputs are the direct result of your program activities. They usually describe the size or the scope of the services of the products. And again, this is the sort of thing that we used to report to our boards of directors. Numbers of people served, numbers of times that people went through a particular program. So classes taught, meetings held, material that was produced or distributed, even participation rates, hours of service. All of those are the kinds of things that outputs are. And yes, those are important because they tell us whether or not we actually reached, which is why it's called a reach, the people that we said that we were going to reach, or in the way that we thought we were going to. But ultimately then what we are looking for is those outcomes, and those are the things that are things that change. So a few more things about output. So the activities are what we do, who we reach, and the activities, if we look at them, are, you know, these are terms that you can use when you're describing your activities. You can train, you can teach, you deliver services, you develop a project, you network with other people, you build these partnerships, all of that. And then participants, it's important to be pretty clear about who your participants are, because those are the people that you want to measure. And I remember one evaluation that I was doing one time where this was an organization that was trying to, at least it said that it was trying to reach children, but most of the activities that they ended up doing were support groups for adults. And so the question became, if you are providing this service and you say it's for this particular group, then how are we going to show that this particular group is actually receiving the service? And that's why outputs are important, because they help us to then track whether or not something got delivered to the people we should have delivered it to. Okay, so throw some outputs on to the chat if you would be willing to. What are some things that you can measure that are just counting the numbers of things? I'll wait just for a second here and read some off as they come across. I gave a couple of examples, numbers of vaccines. Okay, yeah, number of parents attending a program, assistance to meet emergency needs, right? Rent, utilities, all of those kinds of things, number of students graduating, the attendance at certain things, the number of people that attended workshops. Yeah, you guys got it. People who are attending groups, the number of people seeking counseling. Yep, receiving their CDA credential. Yep, numbers of hours involved, reduction of births. I would argue that that is an output and an outcome in some ways, the reduction of infant births, because that's really what you want as your ultimate change. So that's a really good example of an output that's also a change that you really want to see, because that's kind of your ultimate, but you can count it in a really simple way. Number of parents that LGBT kids reached. Yep, perfect. Yeah, good. You totally nailed it. Okay, so yeah, outcomes. So again, you saw this once before, but let me just hit it one more time. You're looking for changes in attitudes or behaviors or knowledge or skills or the status that they're at. Like the CDA training would be a status thing, right? They do this training and then they get this certificate and that gives them a new status. Or maybe they, graduate from some sort of program or something. That's a different status than they were before. Level of functioning, that's oftentimes a way that we measure things like mental health or coping abilities in communities or things like that. So you don't have to measure everything, but you need to think to yourself, what can I measure that's pretty straightforward and pretty simple? And if you think about these things in broad terms, these categories, these attitude, behavior, knowledge, skills, status, sometimes that can help you to sort of say, all right, what am I trying to measure? Am I trying to change how people think about something? So if it's maybe helping LGBT kids to have better self-esteem or pride in their own identity, that would be an attitude shift, right? If we were wanting to change bullying in schools against people who are LGBT, then that would be a behavior measure. If I wanted people to better understand how LGBT individuals have to deal with certain kinds of life situations, or to better understand what it means to be somebody who's gay or lesbian or transgender or bisexual, then that's a knowledge piece. Maybe I'm trying to educate the kids who are the target audience, or maybe I'm trying to educate parents, or right. So you can kind of think about, depending on what change you're trying to create, what you want to use as your measurement. And the key issue is that it needs to be measurable and it needs to link to your program activities. And if you can link it to your program activities, then can you measure it? And if you can, then you have the kind of framework that you need to have in order for a measurable outcome to be measured. So here are some more ideas. Short term could be things like learning, changes in, and again, you saw this before, but changes in knowledge, awareness, skills, opinion, aspirations, motivation, behavioral intent. Medium, and I would argue that behavior could be over here too, and so could decision making. But in the medium term, things like policy changes and social action and things like that, that's much more medium term. And then the long term, those are the big ticket items that we've talked about before. But usually when you think about it, think about, probably for United Way, am I thinking every 6 months? Is that right, Amanda? That they're doing some sort of a report?
That is the current stand, but we will be changing that to annually. So
To
there's a little
annually,
sneak
wow. Did they all know this?
Not yet.
Wow. Well, this is really good news. There was this collective sigh of relief that just went up among the group.
Especially those current funded partners. That won't change until the new funding cycle, though. Just be prepared.
Okay, so guidelines for writing outcomes. So when you think about writing an outcome, or you think about what is it that I want to measure, specific is always better than global. That is such an important thing. The more specific you are, the more likely you are to see change. And I've seen way too many programs that try to generically measure something, and then they find out that they can't measure it because what they did for their intervention wasn't what they were actually really specifically measuring. So specific is important, clear and specific, concise, realistic and achievable, shows a direction. We already talked a lot about that. Just what do you want to increase? What do you want to decrease? And that it indicates this target so you know that you've achieved something. So the best outcomes even go so far as to say 20% of our target audience will have achieved such and such a reduction in so-and-so by such and such a date. That kind of thing is really, really behaviorally specific, and oftentimes then creates some sort of a target for you to shoot for. Okay, so last thing before a break, throw in, if you would, ideas that you might have for outcomes. What are some things that you might think of? Don't worry about the long-term ones, but for short-term, if you were thinking 6 months to a year, for all of those activities that you just put up, what would be some outcomes that you think that you could measure? Okay, parents state that they read more to their children. Yeah, definitely. Even better, we'd love to see that reading scores have improved, but even talking about parents reading is a step toward that goal. Met number of targets in a 6-month assessment. I'd want to know what the targets would be. Let's see, boy, these things come in fast here. Better school attendance. Yeah, that's actually a really easy one to measure. Ultimately, what we'd like to see, we know that school attendance is linked to better student outcomes, but we'd want to ultimately see whether kids that show up at school actually do better. So sometimes it's easier to see if grades improved than it is just that they attended. So an attendance could be more likely a output, which leads to the outcome of, is student performance better, and ultimately did they graduate from high school or from 8th grade or whatever it is you're working on. Let's see here, retaining knowledge from the end of the school year, right? That's the bugaboo that we always try and measure across all of those test scores in schools, and that we all rail against but love to hate, because we're trying to see whether or not our kids actually have learned anything from the time they started. So one of the ways that we do that is sometimes with a pre-test at the beginning and a post-test at the end, and there are ways that you can measure knowledge that way. Increase knowledge, stress levels of caregivers, to reduce those. Yeah, definitely. And so there are stress instruments. Maybe that's not the term to use. There are instruments that measure levels of stress, and you could give caregivers, a series of caregivers that are your target audience, the stress levels before they do your intervention and then after you do the intervention, and see whether or not there are any changes. And there's super simple ways that you can do that analysis and see whether change is taking place. Increased knowledge of and attitudes, changes in attitude about LGBTQ people. That would not be for the target of the LGBT individuals. That would be for people in the community or in the school or something like that. So you'd have to think about who am I targeting with my intervention, and then you use that to then say, and then how do I want to make that measurement? New understanding. So that sounds like knowledge of how career goals and personal finance can create economic freedom. Economic freedom is a hard one to measure. That sounds like an impact, but we could measure how their personal finances have improved, or their perception of their finances, or knowledge about changes in how they manage their finances. All of those things could be measured in the short term and could be really good. Children achieving 3rd grade reading based on pre and post testing. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, there are a bunch more here too. Mom's getting monthly prenatal appointments. That's a good one. That's an output, which we hope will lead to better outcomes for the kids, right? Or I guess at this point that's prenatal. So we would hope for a successful, happy, healthy baby that's delivered, right? So that would be our ultimate outcome, that there would be, a child that would come in a healthy delivery and would not have any, low birth weight or other kinds of things. So we'd measure maybe those kinds of things, even though the monthly prenatal appointments are key outputs to the ultimate outcome of changing a child's life. Okay, I think, yeah, you guys keep sending in more and we could probably keep talking about them, but you probably get the idea and you're tired of having me continue on when I could be done. So let's do this. It is 1:55. Oh, I blathered on for 53 minutes or something. I'm so sorry. Amanda, what's a good time for a break? Do you have a suggestion for how long you want them to be able to go off and get refreshments and restroom breaks and things?
Do we want to do 10 minutes? Or how about 2:05? It'll be less, just a little under 10 minutes.
2:05, perfect.
All right, if you have not put your name and organization in the chat, please do so. I have a couple people that have not yet, so please do so. I will appreciate that. And be back at 2:05.
Okay, and we'll shift gears at that point and talk about the difference between process and outcome evaluations. See you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, we may end up, I don't know, this is something we should talk about on the side, Amanda, about whether or not it would even be helpful to have some, some consult time just to kind of brainstorm with people that might need it at some point. I don't know. Because there's lots of different ways to measure things, and some of it is just kind of thinking through, would this work? Would that work? How do we make this, set up so that we can actually do it easily and, streamlined kind of way?
Sure.
But I don't know, that maybe, because each one of these has a whole different sort of set of answers that could be talked through. And some of them need to have questions that you ask before the answers can be thought through.
Okay. Well, I will let you go ahead and get started.
Okay. Okay, thanks everybody for coming back. I think, I don't know how many people are back. Is 62, something like that? I can't see now anymore because I've got a screen that's on here, but I'm only going to tell you about 2 different kinds of evaluation. They usually, when we do a class, I'll talk about 4 different kinds and we talk about the differences between them. But at the end of the day, the only 2 that you probably are likely to use or really care about are called process evaluations and outcome evaluations. And outcome would make the most sense because that's what we've been talking about. But it's also possible to do what's called process evaluations. And while we don't have time to really go through what this looks like, it's important to know that it exists because it's the way that you help your internal program to know whether it's working in the year between when you give your report to Amanda at the United Way and all of the time that happens in between. So process evaluation is really a way that you're doing internal tracking and internal monitoring to see whether or not things are changing. So that's basically, think of process as kind of like you're watching a movie and over time, you're seeing this movie kind of go in front of you. That's the time that passes with your program and the kinds of activities that you're doing and things like that. And so periodically you are measuring the changes that are taking place as you're moving through time. Whereas think of an outcome evaluation as a snapshot at a point in time. So there's this point in time 1 year after you get your funding that the United Way wants you to submit a report. That's an outcome evaluation usually, and that is like a snapshot of that point in time. So process evaluation happens over time, and it's usually designed to help you to understand whether or not what you plan to do is actually happening. And so you're tracking that as it goes through time. So when you think about process evaluations, generally you think about this is its purpose, to assess the degree to which your program is being conducted like you planned it to be. That you could compare program delivery across staff or across sites. Maybe you do it by gender, or you do it by ethnicity, or you have these different ways in which you make comparisons, but you're comparing the same program maybe in different places, where you're linking specific methods of the program delivery to your outcomes. And so you maybe try and do third grade reading in such and such a way, and then you try a different kind of way, and you see whether or not each of those methods is working in a different sort of way. Or maybe you're providing information to improve different program elements, so you're tracking to see whether or not changes are happening over time. Feedback for program managers regarding the quality of their implementation, and then information on accountability to stakeholders. Stakeholders oftentimes like to see how change is happening over time. So that's kind of the purpose of process evaluations. So here's how you know if it's a process evaluation. Well, generally, it's internally driven, meaning that you're the one that's asking for it in your agency. You're the one that's in charge of it. It's not the United Way that's asking you for it. It's you saying, I want to know more about whether my program is working and whether or not I'm kind of moving it along successfully. So generally, it's more likely to be cooperative staff because they feel like they're part of the process. They oftentimes help to design something, and then they want to help to measure it as well. Generally, it's non-intrusive because it's all happening in-house. And the key point, ongoing continuous feedback. So that means that some of the things that you're asking are qualitative in nature. So here's my quick definition of the difference between qualitative and quantitative data. Think of quantitative data as quantity. In other words, we're measuring generally with numbers, we're measuring what changes have happened. So surveys that have, strongly agree to strongly disagree on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to do such and such and so and so, anything where the result is measured through a number, we generally call it quantitative. If it's measured through words, meaning people are talking and we, ask them an open-ended question like, what do you think of the program and the, reason why we're doing it, or tell us a little bit about what you like about the program, or are there any suggestions you'd make for improvements? Those are all open-ended questions where people type in a response, or maybe you interview them, or you do a focus group or something like that. That's qualitative data, and you're measuring the words, meaning that you're measuring themes and you're measuring perspectives, but it's all because they've typed in or talked to you, and you're now trying to come up with some way of making sense out of it all. So quantitative numbers, qualitative words. And that doesn't mean that you're not asking them questions using words. That can still be quantitative, but it's qualitative when you're asking open-ended questions where people talk or where people type a lot. Another characteristic of this kind of process evaluation is that the changes are oftentimes accepted and incorporated because they're being run internally. We measure them, we want the change to happen, and so we incorporate it. And then minor changes are oftentimes needed because at the end of the day, you're continuing to measure this stuff over time and you're making improvements. The whole idea of process evaluation is feedback. You're taking information, collecting it, and then feeding it back into the program to make it better. That's really, really the key to process evaluation. So examples, the fancy ones are, continuous quality improvement and total quality monitoring and Sigma 7. But look, most of us aren't in big organizations that have an evaluation system. Most of the time we have small staff with, limited numbers of people. And so instead of doing things that are, really complex, we have ways that we measure things in small increments, and then we feed that information back as it relates to a particular program. So you're not waiting a year to make the program better. You're doing this on an ongoing basis. Okay, so the advantages, well, you can imagine, certainly the program is more likely to understand it because they're the one that's collecting the data. They can also examine information at different stages in detail, and that's really helpful because you can kind of break it into its component parts. The feedback is generally relevant, which means that staff are more likely to cooperate, and if it's relevant to them, they're more likely to use it, right? Timely feedback, it's most likely to be useful if you can then use it to make improvements. At the end of the year, while the United Way wants you to deliver an evaluation report of some sort to say how things are going, well, that's really hard to make changes at the end of a year if you've been doing something the same way all the way through. So if you can do process evaluation where you use the feedback loops that you've created for collecting the data and then talking about the data and then making changes based on the data, then you're more likely to have a product that actually shows change when it's time to do your outcome evaluation and you report that to the United Way. And somebody's also going to ask, can we use process evaluation in our report to the United Way? Well, probably, because if you're able to show changes that are happening over time, that's a pretty good way to do that. It's just not as maybe as deep as you might go if you were doing it with a regular outcome evaluation. Disadvantages, well, it can be time consuming. It's adding one more layer to the to-do list of everybody because they're having to track and monitor things. And ultimately, it's either, it could be more paperwork or it could be more computer, whatever we call our computer generated documentation. So lots of different ways that we can ask questions for process evaluation. Here are a bunch of examples here. Was each program activity completed as was planned? How many people or programs or workplaces was each activity delivered? That's an output. How many program materials were distributed? That's an output. That's short term. What were their perceptions of each activity or of the program? What were staff members' perceptions of the program? What were the strengths? What were the difficulties, barriers, challenges? Those things are oftentimes measured by asking people questions that are open-ended. Tell us about what you thought about the program. What is it that you'd like to see improved? What changes do you think need to continue moving forward? Those are all questions that you then collect and then compile together with themes, and then you can figure out whether or not what you're doing is actually working and moving things forward. Okay, now outcome evaluations. We just talked about process evaluations through time and space. Now outcome evaluations. Generally, we think of, remember, short-term outcome evaluations are anywhere between immediately after the program is done to anywhere between, maybe 3 years at the longest, but that might be considered short-term. It might be considered medium-term at that point. But anything from the end of a program to at least 1, maybe 2 years, I think of as short-term. And so we think of short-term evaluations as the process of assessing indicators to the program's process toward their ultimate goals. So that's really mostly what we talked about with the logic model, is we talked about outcomes, and that typically measures the changes in outcomes such as knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, skills, behaviors, all of that stuff. So we've talked about this already. Whether it creates changes in the short term and whether more immediately results of the program need to be changed. So here's where things get a little more complicated. Usually outcome evaluations are externally driven. The United Way tells you 1 year after you've gotten your funding that you have to turn in an evaluation report. That means that it's more likely that you're going to have a negative reaction. One more thing I have to do. I can't believe that they're making us show our work. Of course we're working hard, and of course we're doing the things we need to, and of course change is happening. Well, the United Way says, well, we still want to see it because we want to make sure that change is actually happening. So it's more likely that staff are going to be resistant. It's more likely that it feels intrusive because somebody else is telling you to do it rather than you doing it yourself internally. Oftentimes, outcomes happen at the end of a period of time. And so you are just looking at one point in the process. Remember that snapshot idea. And so you're not getting regular feedback from staff, or you might, get only periodic information or feedback from the staff. There sometimes can be resistance to implementation of the outcome evaluation. And oftentimes the outcomes come with recommendations. This is what we think you should do, particularly if it's being done from an external organization. Like I've done evaluations for different agencies or organizations, and at the end I put in recommendations. These are the things based on what we found that we think that you should do in order to make improvements or make changes. And so that oftentimes is larger recommended changes because it's taken a longer period of time for those changes to emerge. Oftentimes it's not as practical in applied settings, because if you were going to do it in a pure way, you'd have a control group and an experimental group, if those terms make any sense to you. But it's still, I would argue, very possible to do decent outcome evaluations, even if you don't do pure evaluation from a kind of pure research perspective. Yeah, I won't tell you about any of those. It's the most common method of evaluation, but it has a lot of negatives in the sense that people sometimes can be resistant and it's intrusive, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes people do feel fear, or it feels like it's one more thing that has to be done. And so there's this foot dragging, I can't believe that they're making us do this. And believe me, our program at Andrews University, our social work program, every 8 years we have a huge accreditation, and I absolutely dread it. And it's one of the worst times of my life. And I'm an evaluator and I still hate it because it's just not that fulfilling to do this stuff. On the other hand, I always find that when I do evaluation, it makes my program better. It just does, because I'm exploring things that I wouldn't have looked at, or I'm finding things out that I wouldn't have uncovered otherwise. And I'm using the feedback that I get in order to make changes. And so outcome evaluations are a real pain, but what our organization tries to help us to do is to do them in process rather than just outcome only. Okay. When to use it: when you need good access to data, when you need program understanding, and you need your data to justify that you're doing well, your program is successful, and it's continuously changing. Okay, I think that's all I want to say about the difference between process and outcome evaluations, but it's a really important difference. And I thought it might be helpful to know the difference, because you just do evaluation differently depending on what kind of evaluation you're trying to do. Okay, but I thought you might find it useful to learn how to put survey questions together. Just a really practical skill of how do I actually write a survey, because there are lots of really, really bad surveys out there. And I see them all the time. I get emails constantly saying, would you evaluate such and such? Or we have this thing that we want you to, to fill out. And usually what I'll do is I'll look through it really quickly. And if it looks like it's poorly designed, and if it's not asking good questions, I'm sorry, I just delete it and I never take another look, because bad data collection leads to bad reporting, and that means that change isn't really going to take place. So I don't want to be a snob about it, but I tend to be picky about wanting to make sure that good questions are being asked, because that's when good information will be collected and good reporting actually happens. So one of the things that I like to do is to go and share with students this document. And I'm sure that we can have Amanda distribute this. I can send this to her. So this happens to be a SurveyMonkey document that is designed to help you to write better questionnaires. And I've jumped to page, I don't know, 12, 13, 14, page 8. Okay. Just to the question do's and don'ts. And I thought this might be a really practical thing to go through. And remember that this is going in 2 parts. So today I'll be doing some of the question development stuff. And then next time I'll do more on how to develop other kinds of surveys, and probably even talk about how to do qualitative data collection a little bit, maybe about focus groups or some other ways that you can collect data, and also to talk about how you can build a survey online so that it's super simple. So I'm going to just do as far as we can get today with how you do put together some good surveys. And so these are kind of tips and tricks that are really helpful, I think, to putting together good questions. And I'll even give you a document in just a minute that's really cool, that if you're wanting to use things like strongly agree to strongly disagree, there's a document that you can use as a cheat sheet that can help you with putting some things together. And that speeds things up as well. Okay, so a few question writing do's and don'ts. The first one is to consider your respondents. And so that really means if I know my audience well, I'm not just going to write up a bunch of questions and then send it out. I'm probably going to, first of all, try and make my questions tailored to their particular interests or their level of education. If I'm doing a survey, most people would argue that you don't want to make a survey more than 7th to 8th grade level. And that means that you use really clear, concise, uncomplicated language, because if you don't, you're going to lose people, or people are going to misunderstand, or they're just not going to do the survey. So it needs to be pretty clear. The other thing that I like to do when I write survey questions is to send them out to a group of recipients that could be taking this survey. And that means that I need to get their feedback about what they do or don't understand, or maybe the language that I used wasn't really good language or wasn't appropriate for the group that I was surveying. So I always, once I'm done with a survey, send it out for a trial balloon out to a few people that I know are going to be the people who will be taking it, and asking them to give me some feedback. And that's really helpful. That means that you're much more likely to have people fill out the survey cleanly and clearly, and also to finish the survey. So they give examples like, don't ask questions like, do you own a tablet PC? But to be specific, if you're going to ask that question, to give examples, or to avoid asking vague questions like, what was the state of the cleanliness of your room? Well, that's just convoluted language, and the word cleanliness is, not necessary. So how clean was your room? Making things short and clean and clear is really important. And also not asking two questions within the same one. How clean was your room, and what was the most important thing that you found when you cleaned it? You can't stack questions within questions. And so it's important to break questions out separately if you have separate concepts that you're trying to look at. Question writing do's and don'ts, keep it personal. So the idea is that if you ask people their personal opinion, they're more likely to feel comfortable sharing it than if they think that they're going to be judged or thought of as, oh, I'm not really qualified to answer this question. So you ask questions in the form of, do you feel, or what do you think about, in your opinion, those kinds of things. And that's particularly important when you're asking sensitive questions that might be controversial. I'm thinking, like, for instance, right now, if you're trying to get better understanding of, let's say, LGBTQ plus issues, that's a sensitive issue in society right now. So you want to make sure that you are targeting your audience appropriately and asking questions in such a way that doesn't trigger responses that will, make them upset, or that will make them feel like, they don't want to answer it. That's where giving your survey out to people really helps to kind of let them screen what works and what doesn't work. Time frames. Providing a time frame. So this is only useful if you're going to actually ask them questions that relate to times. And so if you're going to ask them specific questions, then instead of how much do you usually spend on groceries in the past week, about how much did you spend. Now we'll talk about how you can also create ranges for questions as well, so that you're giving them accurate ways to select their options. And I can even talk to you about how to set up your demographic questions so that people are more likely to answer them, because people oftentimes don't want to answer if they don't think that the question, or if they think the question is too intrusive. For instance, how much money did you make last year? Most people don't answer that. But if you can ask it in such a way where you're asking people to estimate the range within a range of, 10,000 to 25,000 or 25,000 to 50,000, people will much more likely answer it in categories than they will if it's something that's very, very specific. But you can also be very careful when you're putting things like timeframes or amounts, that you very carefully ask those questions so that they're really specific. So this pro tip here, I think, is a really useful one. Include your time frame up front for added emphasis. Yesterday, did you? In the past week, have you? How many times in the past 30 days have you? In the next 12 months, how often or will you do such and such and so and so? Questions coming, hold on. Mary Jo saying, and if you use ranges used by larger research institutions, you'll have a great way to compare results with larger pools of folks. Excellent point, yes. In fact, I'm gonna expand that point just a little bit. If you can find surveys that have been created by other organizations or institutions that are doing similar things to you, then use them. Now, you might have to ask permission, and that's very appropriate, and it's something that you should generally do, unless it's a survey that's being thrown out there to the general public. Like if you're getting questions from the Pew Research Center or a Gallup poll or something like that, those are usually not copyrighted because they're being used to a really large audience across the United States. And most of the time we don't use those kinds of questions for agency-based surveys. But if we're looking at changing certain kinds of things, we might find that there are other organizations that have done similar kinds of interventions. And if they have, has somebody done an evaluation on it? And if they have, can we find that topic in Google Scholar, or can we find that in a web search of some sort, and then find a tool that can measure it? I'm always amazed when I just type in a Google search and I just put in measurement of, I don't know, anxiety, or measurement of reading behaviors, or measurement of vaccine awareness. People do, I mean, we live in a country that has millions of people, and of those millions of people, dozens of them at least are probably doing similar things to what we're all trying to do, because human problems are human problems and they occur in lots of places around the country. So if you can work smart rather than hard, you are going to save yourself huge amounts of time. And so a good survey search, and I usually use the term measurement of, or survey of, or how to measure, whatever your key terms are. And also, I would say modify your terms a little bit. What I find is that maybe one term wasn't quite on point, but if I use the term, I don't know, let's say that I'm trying to measure something like, I don't know, adjustment to school. Now that's really vague, and we might not find something that helps us to measure adjustment to school. But what if we started to think about, well, are there other ways to think about this? Okay, are we trying to reduce anxiety? All right, I can search for anxiety. I can search for stress reduction. I can search for mindfulness measurement. I mean, there are all kinds of ways, if we use the right term, that you'll find that there are measurements out there. But yes, totally agree. Don't recreate the wheel, especially when there are plenty of organizations out there that are probably doing the same thing you are. So that's super important. Thank you, Mary Jo, for that. Let's see. Okay, let's scoot down a little bit further here. Oh, this is always a tricky one. Anytime you're working with an issue that is controversial in any way, you have to be really careful about writing your questions out. And as they say here, read on for 5 common mistakes that can lead to low quality results. Leading questions, loaded questions, unbalanced questions, double-barreled questions, and confusing questions. And each one of these, I'm not going to go through each one of them, because you'll have this document and you'll be able to browse through it. But be aware that if you are doing something that has a controversial element to it within the community or this society that we live in, that you have to be extra careful. And what I often try to do when I'm writing survey questions is I will send them out to people on what I would call both sides of the issue to try and see what sorts of problems they have. And sometimes one group will think, this is great, no problems at all. And the other group would say, I can't believe you asked it in that way. That is so biased. That's such a leading question. That is so inappropriate. So whenever you're dealing with highly controversial or complex topics that have many perspectives, we'll put it that way, I would say that it's important for you to then try to run those ideas past others, not just your own kind of internal group that you're working with. Let's see, overly broad, yes. Overly broad question. Yeah, I won't even say anything more about that. That's just too broad to even talk about. Okay, let's talk about closed-ended versus open-ended questions. Now, next time we meet, sometime in August, I will show you Google Forms and how to set up both closed-ended and open-ended questions. And so if you are writing an open-ended question, you can see the upper right here, the example is in a text box. What was the single most important reason you gave our ice cream shop a low rating? And so you can see it's a very specific kind of open-ended question. And then people, type in their responses. And so if you have a large response group, you can have, dozens and sometimes hundreds of responses that you then need to analyze using themes in order to kind of combine them together in ways that make sense. We'll talk a little bit about that next week, but I think it's really important anytime you ask closed-ended questions like the one on the left, an example, what was the single most important reason you gave our ice cream shop a low rating? So it gives these 5 questions and we can select from 4 questions. We can select from one of those. But even so, I'd want to make sure that I also had an open-ended question at the end of many of the sections. Now, it doesn't have to be after each question, but at the end of a section, what I'm asking questions about, I'm a really big believer that a qualitative question to allow people to type in why they couldn't answer a question, or this answer wasn't reflective of my perspective and I need to say more about it. We did not too long ago a survey of it was a voting survey of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because Andrew's a Seventh-day Adventist and I have a group of people that were really interested in some of the political opinions of the church. And so we decided we were going to send out a survey and ask people who they were going to vote for and what are the reasons why they were going to vote. We knew that it was controversial and it was going to cause all kinds of conflict. We didn't realize how much it was going to cause. We sent out our survey advertising it in a couple of different church affiliated journals. And we got, I don't know, close to 1,800 responses. And at the end, we asked one simple question. We said, is there anything else you'd like to say about this survey? And we had 700 people that typed in responses of all varieties. I mean, things about, politics, and some people who were, on the extreme left, some people that were on the extreme right, and some people that, thought the end of the world was coming and they were going to type about all of that. And it was just really surprising that just one simple block of blank text opening gave us so much information, and much richer and more complex than we would have ever gotten if we were just asking our closed-ended questions that had single responses to them. So I'm a big believer in doing both. If you want the technical term for it, this is called mixed method evaluation, but that's just a fancy term for saying that it has both closed and open-ended questions. Hold on, there's a chat question here. Let me just run down to it really quick and see if it's something that we want to talk about. Closed-ended questions like a checkbox. Some force you to pick an option, but none may apply. Should we always have an other? Yes, I'm a big believer. And this is going to actually show us this in just a second when I scroll down just a little bit further. But I'm a big believer in giving people an other option that they can type in their own response. Let's see here. I'm going to scoot down just for a second and see if I can find that one, because I remember seeing that and I'm not seeing it. This is just making everybody dizzy. Sorry. Let me just talk about it for just a second. Yeah. So instead of these four options, price was too high, didn't like the ice cream taste, location isn't convenient, staff isn't friendly. Maybe they just don't like ice cream, but they didn't have a space to type that in. And so they don't know what to do with themselves. And so I always put an other option at the bottom with a blank line and they can type it in. Now, if there are only, let's say there are 100 people that responded and there were only 4 people that said something in the other box, I probably am not going to even worry about it because it allowed them to have a space to type something, but I'm not going to try and analyze any themes. It's just too small a number. But if I have, 30 people that typed in other, then I'm going to know that my question was flawed because I didn't give them enough options or the right kinds of options. And so I can learn from that just by seeing what kinds of things people type in. Okay, good question. Limit them to one selection. So I'll show you next week some different ways that you can set things up. There are some times when you want to use check all that apply, not just a single option. And sometimes that's really important. But oftentimes you want to try and limit it to one selection because then you can get a real sense of the highest to the lowest priorities. We'll talk about that next week, I think, a little bit more. We'll also talk in just a second about the ranges that you give. Like you can see here, extremely likely, very likely, moderately likely, slightly likely, not at all likely. Do we really need that many options, and do those really have enough value between those two that it matters? Well, if you get too many, I know that some people, they like to have 7 categories from extremely this to extremely not that, and they have this whole range. And yes, you can get nuances for people that might be more comfortable for them, but it also makes it frustrating because you usually end up having small blocks of responses within each category. And so you end up having to combine them together anyway. And that's a harder thing to do when you're doing analysis. So I tend to be somebody who likes a few less categories, like usually 5 is good enough, and usually giving them the option of neither agree or disagree or not sure or something like that is a helpful thing to give too for people that just aren't quite sure what to do with themselves. I'll show you that in just a second. In fact, I think I'm going to stop share and show you this really cool document I found the other, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago. Now, this is the kind of thing that only an evaluator would get excited about, but you'll just have to bear with me for a second. So this is called Likert scales, and that's just the term that's used for anything that gives you sort of a range of options where you use the same kind of measurement system in order to measure something. So this is broken down into ways in which you can do these measurements. And the cool thing about this is that it gives you lots of different choices within the same dimension. So this one has to do with agreement. So any questions that you want to ask people if they agree or disagree, here are the ranges of things that you can choose, all the way from strongly agree, agree, undecided, disagree, strongly disagree. So that's the 5 that I was talking about. Here's 7, 6, yeah. Here's 2. I'm not a big fan of 2. Anytime you do yes, no, or agree, disagree, you don't really have enough information to really understand well what's going on. So I tend to like ranges rather than dichotomy, meaning that it's either this or it's that. Later on, if you're wanting to do fancier analyses, you can combine categories together and you can create things that make it so that a person either is or isn't. But in these cases, I think it's better not to have too many, and better also not to have too few, even though these are sort of giving you the range of options. But if we go down to the next one, oh, there are even more. Yes, so you can see disagree strongly as opposed to strongly disagree. So tend to disagree, tend to agree, agree strongly. So there's, again, the value of this is that it keeps your category differences between the items the same. In other words, you're using the same kind of language. And the idea between measurement is you're trying to assume that there's an equal distance between each one of the categories. So the distance, I don't know if this makes sense, but the distance between strongly agree and agree is kind of the same as the difference between disagree and strongly disagree. So that you can measure things and still have them make sense statistically. So that's has to do with agreement. This one has to do with frequency, and you can see that there are a whole bunch of ways that you can measure frequency, from very frequently to very infrequently to never, always, usually, about half the time, seldom, never, almost always, to a considerable degree. Any of these will work because there's still ways of measuring increments across the categories. And it's nice to find these because it really does help you to kind of do the shorthand where you're not making it up. And I've read, so many surveys where people just make these things up, and you start to find that halfway through, they sort of changed a word or they've changed the category. So that on the front end, they talked about strongly agree, and on the back end, they're saying really disagree or disagree a lot. They're using different categories of words to try and mean the same thing, and they don't. So this is a really kind of shorthand way to do this. Okay, hold on. I've got another chat question. Let me scoot down and take a look just a second here. Andrews University Tests and Measurements Department helped us with our evaluations reliability. Great resource. Yeah, good point. I'm not part of that group, but they are very helpful. Okay, importance. Very important to unimportant, but we either have moderately of little importance, and over here some other ways to do the same configuration. And then you can see the same thing for quality. Very good to very poor, extremely poor, excellent. And you can see it doesn't really matter if you start with the best and go to the worst, or start with the worst and go to the best in terms of quality. So it's kind of showing you could go either direction on that. Sometimes what surveyors will do is they will actually ask a similar question more than once, but reverse the scoring question so that it makes you make sure that people are answering the same thing in the same way, even though the reversing of the categories just means that they're likely to think about it maybe a little bit differently, but you hope that they're going to be consistent with the way that they're responding. Likelihood, like me, unlike me, to a great extent, not at all. Yeah, so anyway, categories of likelihood, quality, importance, frequency, and agreement. So I'll make sure that Amanda sends these out to people too, because I just think it's a really great shorthand document. So let's go back to the Google document. I'm sorry, the SurveyMonkey document just for a second. Use words, not numbers, on a scale of 1 to 10. Yeah, you need to anchor the ideas, that you have an anchor on either side so that you know what the highest number is and what the lowest number is. And don't assume that people just know that. Okay, let me do 3 more of these and then I'll stop. Unipolar versus bipolar. So the idea, this is not a mental health classification. This is how you write your questions. So how many answer choices should there be when it comes to rating with words instead of numbers? Okay, so methodologists have spent a lot of time developing best practices. And to save time and get good results, here's what you need to know. When you write a unipolar question, meaning that it's asking your respondent one attribute or one thing, you're more likely to get reliable estimates. The 5-point scale is the most kind of common and reliable way to do that. So only ask one thing is the best way to do this. And if you want to see what a bipolar question looks like, you can see over on the right there, a bipolar question would be, do you like the ice cream selection at our store? Neither like it or dislike, neither like it nor dislike it or dislike it. So this gets really confusing, and people are kind of confused about what words you're using and how you're trying to use them. And so trying to be, again, clean and simple and ask simple questions in a singular way is oftentimes the best way to set it up. Let's see here. Okay. Use yes, no questions cautiously. The reason for that is that when people have to choose between yes and no, you're forcing them to lose the subtlety that's really important in questionnaires. That's why we like strongly agree through strongly disagree, is because it gives us the intensity of a person's response. And with yes, no, there's some things that are yes, no. Did you use the service that we provided? Did you go to the website? Yes, no. Those kinds of things, obviously, they did or they didn't. They, agree or they don't agree. But at the end of the day, you want to create questions that are broadly giving ranges rather than specifically forcing them to either choose one or the other. Hold on, chat. For strawberry ice cream, I would have a hard time. I don't like strawberry ice cream, right? Thank you, Sherry. That's a very good point. All right. Okay, this is the last thing I think I'll talk about. So the measuring how much. And this will have a little bit to do with how you write demographic questions as well. Measuring how much is really, you have to be careful how you put these categories together, because you can fall through the cracks in the level of precision that you maybe don't do. That came out in an odd way, so let's do it as an example. All right, so they're saying, want to know how much respondents spend their time, money, or energy on something? Use a 5 or 7 point scale with words when respondents might not be able to easily recall precise numbers. So if you think that they may not know their actual budget or their actual annual income or their actual amount of time that they spent watching the internet or being on their phone or something like that, you can ask questions that would be in ranges. All of my, most of my, about half of my, some of my, none of my, whatever the response happens to be. And that's a good example. Now, I would prefer, if people know how precisely they can measure what they're measuring, that we put them into ranges. And if that's the case, percentages, I think, are a pretty good way to do that, because we can average percentages across responses. And so, 0 to 20, and you notice that it starts at 0 and goes to 20, and then you don't repeat 20 again. Don't go 0 to 20 and then 20 to 40. You go 0 to 20 and then 21 to 40, and then 41 to 60, and 61 to 80, and 81 to 100. And it's pretty reasonable to do it across those 5 categories. I've also seen there's a really cool option, and I'll show you this next week, where people can use a slider bar and they can select an exact percentage. And then when you get your report back from the Google Forms, it'll actually tell you their average without you having to go in and select each one of the items. So that's a cool new way, I think, for people to kind of still approximate. They might settle on 41% or 38% or something like that, but that's kind of where they estimate they are on a particular category. So I'm a big believer, when you create these ranges, that if there's a bottom end and a top end, that you make sure and anchor that. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 equals, none, or very little, and 10 equals I love it a lot, or I'm crazy about it, or something like that. That, I think, helps you to anchor the bottom and the top. And in the same way here, when we're dealing with percentages, you start with 0, you end with 100. On the other hand, if you're talking about things like income level, that's where you want to use ranges that will give them some flexibility and not make them feel like they have to answer a specific number. Don't give them an open-ended, how much did you make last year? You say, you know, what, and make sure the difference between your annual household income and annual personal income, because those are two, as you know, totally different things if you have multiple people that are bringing in income into their family. So for things like money, I tend to give broad ranges, but ranges that have meaningful differences. So when I think about level of poverty, for instance, if it's anything below $30,000, let's say, I mean, I know it varies depending on how many people you have in your household, but you might go $0 to $30,000, and then 30,100 whatever the number is right after 30,001 up to 50,000, and then 50,001 up to 75,000. So, and you're absolutely right, gross and net are often confusing for people as well. So if you're going to say gross or you're going to say net, make sure that you are clear on what that means. After taxes, how much was